Hi, today I'm here to talk about Mexican Gothic. Mexican Gothic is a 2020s novel published by Silvia Moreno Garcia, and it follows Noemi Taboada, an aristocratic debutante Mexican girl, as she is sent to help save her cousin after she sent a bunch of frantic letters to the family. Since she married this man, they got married very quickly. They barely knew each other. The family found it a little strange, but they allowed the marriage to happen. And now she's sending frantic letters asking for help, saying she's been poisoned, she's been seeing monsters. So the works. So Noemi, who's not at all well prepared for this mission, is sent to help her cousin Catalina, and the only thing that helps her is that she is allegedly not afraid. Not afraid of her husband, not afraid of her family, nothing. Along the way, she does find an ally, Francis, the family's youngest son. For this analysis, we will only be focusing on those names because the family is quite extensive. I will put an image of the family tree here. As you can see, it is a big family and the names are a bit confusing sometimes. So we will focus on Catalina, Noemi, and Francis because that's meat and potatoes, let's say, of the story. So she is sent to High Place. High Place is the Doyles, that's the family. Manor. You find stories of violence, trauma, suicide, family relationships burned, eugenics, racism, incest. This family is quite special, let's say. So she does find those things and she aims to save Catalina with the help of Francis, that refuses to be like his family and wants to be like his father, who committed suicide to escape the family since he had no other way to do it. So this is basically the plot of the book. That is more or less what happens in the story without much spoilers. I will give some spoilers in the analysis, but the plot. So how does this tie with classic Hispano-American literature? This novel revives a genre called post-colonialism Gothic. Post-colonialism Gothic was very popular in the late 20th century in colonialized places, and it became really popular because it used elements of the Gothic that, for now, I will elaborate on this further, but for now, let's focus on most Gothic novels were pretty racist. So they used those elements, monsters, hauntings, the works, to represent the long-lasting damage that colonialism has done. So now we are going into the analysis of this book. So first off, in the analysis, this novel takes place shortly after the revolution. We get that based on context clues, and a little before 1953, because that's when women got like their rights and the empowerment of women. So this novel aims to show how Mexico and its families were exploited by families like the Doyles. During colonialism, they were exploited, and now we have to talk about the Doyles. The Doyles are very openly racist. I don't have a better way to say it. They are very openly racist. The Doyles do refer to Mexicans as mulch during the novel. And they do say that the family is mostly inbred. Eugenics is a huge part of this book. And it is a huge part of how we read this book. The family does read a lot of eugenics, and they say that if you keep the genes in the family, you can always predict what the person will be like. I will disprove this in a little bit, but for now, let's focus on that. They do think they can predict what a person will be like without knowing the person because of the genes she has. So if she has they say like, certain types of people have certain types of expressions, and that's important for later. But they do think that by keeping it in the family, they can avoid the other genes that can become violent and things like that. But given that there has been so much incest in the family, they have now become sterile. They have to mingle with the rebel. so they can keep procreating and maintaining the Doyle family name. The Doyles are very much the parasites in this novel. And that is important because this novel was published in 2020 when we were seeing a rise of the racist speech. For example, in Donald Trump, we have to think, in this case, we have to think that Silvia Moreno Garcia is Canadian, but she did have contact with the United States. And in 2020, we were seeing a lot of Donald Trump, mostly. In this case, it's important to focus on him, in the anti-Hispanic speech. The idea is that in this novel, it's not the Mexicans who are the parasites of society. That's what people were saying in the media at the time, especially the United States president. He was saying that Mexicans were parasites that only came to the country to take their jobs. And so Silvia Moreno Garcia uses the Doyles as the parasites. They are what's exploiting the nation. Also, besides being an analogy for what was happening at the time, it is also an analogy to what was happening prior, because during colonialism, the outsiders were very much the parasites. They were exploiting Mexico. They were exploiting those civilizations because they could. Colonialism was in fact very damaging, and they were parasites. And so this does not only showcase the past, but also at the time, the present, with especially the anti-immigrant narrative that we saw in 2020. Now we have to talk about one of the most used symbols in the novel, the house. High Place is a decrepit, falling apart family house, and it stands to represent to the Doyles how the past was great. Most people that live in countries that have colonized other countries, there are some speeches of how the past was great, because they were powerful, because they were rich, because they controlled the world. And High Place stands to represent that. The High Place represents a decrepit past that is very much falling apart, but they refuse to let go of. So now we're going to get back in why the use of the Gothic genre was so important. The Gothic genre is particularly smart. This choice to use Gothic, as in the title, for example, she doesn't use post-colonialism Gothic anywhere. That's what we infer, because that is actually a genre. But she does say that this novel is a Gothic novel. And that is fair. But Gothic is very, very much associated to racism. And more often than not, it does represent the colonized as beasts. One example of this is H.P. Lovecraft. H.P. Lovecraft, later a genre being born called Lovecraftian horror, in honor of him. His novels were very much categorized as Gothic at the time, and they were very much racist. For example, and this is a slight tangent, but it is important. For example, in the case of H.P. Lovecraft, the constant portraying of African people as monkeys and beasts. Sometimes when there was the mixing of races, he would call them degenerate hybrids. So we can see that the Gothic was very much associated with representing the colonized as the beasts and the colonizers as the heroes, as the poor suffering people that had to deal with those beasts. We have a slight plot point, that's the romance with Francis. Francis is, as I said before, the youngest son of the Doyle family. Francis helps Noemi, and they ultimately fall in love, which is cute. I like that. It does undermine the anti-colonialist theme to a more everyone is different theme. I don't think it's bad that Silvia Moreno Garcia did that, but I do think it undermines a little bit of the anti-colonialist narrative that the beginning, especially of the novel, has. The thing that this relationship brings is the theme of nature versus love. So nature versus love is introduced halfway through the novel, around chapter 10, I think. And as I said previously, the Doyles are very much into the whole eugenics thing, and they have a belief that everyone has a nature. So, for example, in the novel, Virgil claims that criminals have a distinct set of facial characteristics. Virgil says that everyone has a set of characteristics about them, be it the eyes, the mouth, the nose, but those people are violent. If they have that characteristic, they're violent, which is disproven later when Ruth starts shooting everyone because no one recognized the violence in her, but she is violent. And that's when it's disproven. Also, nature versus love, Francis is very much raised to be a successor to the family. He is very much raised to keep the family history and ideas going. And he very much does not as soon as he meets Noemi, because he chooses love instead of his nature. For the conclusion, I wanted to do something a little bit different, and I wanted to give an artist review, my review of this book. I did face a problem doing this because I do think this book deserves two different reviews. First on themes and then on execution. So we are first reviewing the themes. That's what we discussed in the analysis chapter of this video. I do very much think that the themes were very good. I did get a little bit sad when we abandoned the anti-colonialist idea to adopt more like everyone is different narrative, and I didn't love that, but I understand why it was done in favor of introducing the nature versus love. I do think that this does deserve a 4 stars. The themes are very much interesting and they are very much there. Now, for the review of the book itself, the book itself does not deserve 4 stars. I gave it a 2.5 stars. Because this book, it doesn't look that long, and it isn't that long, but it could be shorter. It could be 100 pages shorter and there wouldn't be much missing. It does become very repetitive at points, especially during the action in a high place. That is mostly the book, so most of the book is very repetitive, and so much so that sometimes the scenes blend with each other. Sometimes I was reading and thought like, oh, haven't I read this before? It's so weird. I think I have. I hadn't, but the scenes very much blend together, so much so that now if I hadn't had my notes, it would be very hard to remember certain parts and not mix them with other parts. So for me, this book was very much a 2.5 out of 10. I just didn't like the execution of it because it could be shorter, 100 pages shorter, and it wouldn't make a difference. But that is basically it. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you later.